prefer if you address amazing panel as a whole. Now I will let my panelists to introduce themselves. We don't have the tab yet, so let's do the order in the slide, which is Ruth, Mislav, Adel, and then Halman.
Hi everyone, Ruth Salom, she, her pronouns, Baduri Fets, the panel as a whole. Congratulations and all the best.
Hi everyone, Mislav, Hide is fine. Congrats on reaching the finals and good luck.
Hi everyone, Adel here. Hide is also fine with me, and best of luck to both the teams. Hopefully Ateneo wins.
Hello everyone, my name is Halima and I'm also going to be one of the panelists. Best of luck everyone.
Lovely. Also, once again, congratulations on getting this far. I would simply note a couple of housekeeping rules before we start the debate. Please state your POI preference right before speeches. Other speakers can respect that, and we can have as much engagement as possible. Also try to accept at least one POI per speech. They're quite crucial. I will be doing the timekeeping in the chat. Please be mindful of the time because we kind of stopped listening and writing after 8:15. So keep an eye on that. I think this is pretty much it. So without any further ado, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to start this debate. Here.
Hello. Let me just set up my timer real quick. Also, before I start, shout out to all Ateneo teams, Ateneo White, Ateneo Blue, Ateneo Black, and to everyone from Ateneo who is observing the finals. Really proud of us. We've made it this far, guys. My pronouns are she, her, but I'd rather you address me by my speaker position clearly. I will take a POI through chat, but I'll take one by 5. Just really want to say, I'm happy to be here. Yay. As a woman in the debate community, it goes without saying women in discourse only have each other. We must operate with compassion towards each other because of all people, we understand their struggles. 3 key pieces of characterization to set up today's debate. Firstly, these states are very conservative. Men already dominate corporations, media, industries, and the government. There are less progressive movements pushing for laws like divorce or reproductive bills. This means to say that they are likely to be backwards in thinking, and that one, it's very hard for female politicians to even gain a minimal amount of political power and support just because they are women. And 2, it's very hard for a progressive women's group to even have a representative from their own community or minority group in the government. Secondly, given this context, what do these progressive women's groups within these states ought to advocate for the change in the policies in order for better treatment of women within these states? It ought not to contribute further to the already widespread sexist and misogynist outlook against women by also attacking women who made mistakes or supporting a policy against poor or killing people. OP may say that they have to call these things out, but 1, this model will still exist because in a conservative state, they, like the men, other groups, other activist politicians, probably already are attacking these women anyway. And 2, the progressive group for the movement should not be part of this attack against a woman because it involves aggressive remarks about these politicians on social media, violent protests, and forceful narratives like asking them to opt out of the state completely. This just further solidifies the harmful narratives within these states, saying that women are being hated by the same women. Women aren't really capable of being leaders. Thirdly, our stance in counterfactual is very simple. We're okay with not attacking them. Rather, the counterfactual is to try and negotiate with this politician for the progressive policies that they want. This is exclusive because attacking means you're going to villainize these women, and it's going to be a lot harder to reach out to them and ask them to do a particular policy. Instead, when you're literally asking them to step down, this means that we're okay with utilizing the already limited power of women within these states as a progressive group for women. 2 arguments for you in today's debate. 1, how it is principally unjustified to attack the female politician, and 2, why this is good for the progressive female groups. Moving on to our first argument, why is it principally unjustified to attack the female politicians? 2 reasons under this. Firstly, the female politician is a victim of the patriarchal nature of their country. Not only is this person a female, but it is likely that this politician had to be trained under and go through a conservative government. This means that we cannot expect a female politician to automatically be very progressive in signing policies. It was simply not their incentive to harm any women, but simply it was a result of their environment, and they are simply a victim of it. Most of the time, they have no choice and are left to sign a policy that they did not even implement to survive in a male-dominated administration. It's terrible for a women's group to attack this female politician politician because one, it affects the reputation of the group, and two, this affects the reputation of the female politician. They do not deserve to be punished. On top of that, attacking the female politician contradicts their whole advocacy. When you have forceful, aggressive, and violent tactics towards the female politician, you only prove the patriarchy right. This means to say that the group agrees that a woman should not have a place in Congress and that a woman with a position is failing to achieve their goals. The group also endangers their own credibility because at the end of the day, they are a group of women who are attacking someone that they pledged to protect. Comparatively, when you have negotiations with the female politician, there is a greater likelihood to achieve progressive policies because you don't ruin anyone's reputation and you make your needs and wants as a progressive movement much clearer to the politician that is already there in power, and you wouldn't otherwise access this benefit if all you've ever left with are male politicians. But then let's further prove the likelihood of negotiations triumphing over direct attacks, because progressive women's groups negotiating and discussing the lapses in their policies, should they arise, is more likely to make these female politicians change their minds anyway. Because as a progressive group, you of most people must understand what it feels like to be a woman in politics. You are vulnerable to misogynistic complaints, and being a woman immediately makes the job 10 times more difficult because of this. So when you offer a platform to peacefully discuss the policies in question with said politicians, these women are more likely to listen because they aren't being scorned publicly. They are more likely to open themselves up if they know they won't be dissected for every single flaw in their policy. What's the impact here? Women are more likely to feel invalidated when you do not refrain from attacking. It becomes more difficult to point out how to achieve change when we need female politicians who understand and are likely to sympathize with the struggles of women in the first place. Before I move on, I'll take a point if there's any.
Yeah, so I'm still unclear why a Republican man would want to attack a Republican woman if they're in the same party. Likely the woman has already internalized a lot of these things and not forced to do so, as you have explained in your frame.
We're talking about the progressive group here. So like when you say that as a progressive group, you're probably full of women, right? So as a woman, you don't want to attack them. She doesn't deserve to get attacked then. Moving on, I think the second point is very much engaging on that. Secondly, this goes against your values as a progressive women's group because you're literally attacking a woman, someone who your group ought to protect. This has two impacts. Firstly, you are seen as a hypocritical movement who attacks the very people they say they want to protect, and thus you create schemes even within the group. But obviously, many progressive women are all about women bringing each other up. This is where you have much less social capital because you set a precedent for how the rest of your conservative country treats women. If a woman in such a higher place of power could be attacked and ridiculed, the women themselves are okay with this, then what more the wives who don't have power to decide in their homes? Secondly, you greatly lessen the credibility of women in leadership positions and in authority. It is already very rare for a female politician to be seated in power, and at the point in time you think of attacking them, further confirms the notion that yes, women should just stay at home and not be in leadership positions. Moving on to our second argument, let's talk about why this is good for the female progressive groups. This is under one very simple reason on how you get and maintain political capital by having that female politician in power. Because in conservative countries, it is very hard to elect female politicians in power because of the inherent beliefs of conservatism. Voter populations tend to favor men, so women who are able to work through these adversaries to arrive to their current positions must be kept to ensure that in lobbying for things such as abortion or gay marriage or reproductive health bills, there is still a woman who can have her say within those issues. When you actively lessen the credibility of a woman who is already in power, this likely results in two impacts. Firstly, the female politician gets pushed out of power and impeached, which is horrible because women's issues have an urgency to them. They should be addressed now, and the best way that you can get this pushed is through a female politician. Secondly, it is less likely that more female politicians in the future will be elected, since it has already been proven that they are incompetent. This is horrible for your group because it is all the more unlikely that you will get any progressive policies for both the present and the future. Let's talk real quickly about how you get less buy-in for your change as a progressive group. First, you are unlikely to get any more support for your group. A lot of women in conservative countries are likely to be still in the influence of patriarchal conservative ideas, insofar as this has been continuously imposed to them by society. What does this mean? This means that the ideas that progressive women groups push are probably new to them, and they would have to win their hearts. At the point in time they attack female politicians who they are supposed to be fighting for, they will also feel likely attacked because one, this female leader was likely voted in by them and is representative of their views, and the moment that they get attacked, it will also feel like it's a personal attack on them. And secondly, even if they didn't vote for the female leader because they are attacking a woman in power who they say they are also fighting for, they will look incoherent and ununified, which will make it unclear for conservative women as to why they should even support the group in the first place. If you want a group that pushes for advocating for operating with compassion towards these women in positions, for all the more reasons, vote Gov for the greater glory of God. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Leader of Opposition to start a case for opposition. Here.
All right. Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I prefer POIs through voice, so if you have any, I'll take you in between points or at 6. But before that, really quick shout out to Luigi. I don't know if he's still here. And our coaches, Matcha, Jaime, Nico, Isa, RK, etc. My teammates, Pio and Sam, and those who cannot speak right now is Jasmine and Cal. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. A woman's support is not limited to supporting those who look like you, who seem like you. It is about where we actually fight for the vast majority of women whose experiences and pain you've actually felt for, and trying to make it fix and better the status quo. 2 pieces of setup. First, movements have the incentive to protect women from abuse. If you're going to be too radical, people will antagonize you. Movements, and especially progressive women's group, already know that and recognize that politicians themselves will heed to what people want, and politicians will pull away if others pull away. Meaning to say that they won't do anything radical like attack or physically attack them or put them on the street. So it's most likely going to be something about the policies. It's about being critical. It's about being honest and what we actually want to support as a movement, especially for these women on the ground. Second, this debate is not about face value representation, i.e. voting for a woman for the sake of her being a woman. It is about finding policies that support women who are in need in the context of developing nations who are marginalized, limited in power, and need these policies the most to be passed. It is regardless if these policies are going to come from a man or woman or whatnot. All of my responses will be integrated to my argument. 2 pieces of argumentation then. First, where do we actually utilize the lobbying power of these progressive group of women? First, on the framing. The capacity and resources for progressive women's groups is one that is already something that is limited, and if divided, is one that is going to be extremely weakened. Meaning that neutrality means only supporting or passing this stance. There's no private talks that's able to actually pass the messaging of the movement. There's nothing de-incentivizing other individuals and politicians to continue to pass for these bad policies. People in the movement are not likely to feel encompassed for a couple of reasons. One reason is to engage on proposition on these politicians are going to be victims of the patriarchy. Well, so are all women that this politician to continues to harm when they allow these policies to pass. So why is the movement protecting that one privileged woman politician on this platform that have been proved they had to prove by peaceful talks is what's going to sway this deeply patriarchal woman according to this characterization? Why is this something that is likely to change? This is something that is dependent on their capacity to actually do this and unwound these years and years of actually contributing and to continuing to the support of the patriarchal party they continue to have, which is something that's unlikely. What is certain is that why would women in the ground feel like they want to contribute to a group that did not fight for you when a fellow politician confidently passed a policy that forced you to stay with your abusive husband? Women on the ground will feel like joining this movement and continue to support the movement that we are talking about will feel like it's going to antagonize them and hurt them. So this is something that means that even the people who are the most loyal to you will feel like they don't want to continue to support, especially when they protect the most consistent part, which is protecting them and not the most privileged. Second, in the perspective of the moderates, you can sway to your side, especially voters, which is important, if you don't tell the moderates that these certain policies are actually anti-women, anti-feminist, and anti the people you actually care about. There's going to be little information that's going to be spread if it isn't public. They're likely to just keep supporting them. This hasn't made impact. That means a check and balance system of backlash within society is destroyed on proposition side, which leaves more women vulnerable and unable to fight back against the oppression they face in the state. Things like being forced to stay with their husband, things like being forced to carry that baby, and being forced to not being paid as equal as their male counterpart. Why is this specifically crucial to their case? It means that politicians will not be afraid to put out similar painful anti-divorce inequality in pay in the long term and short term. Second impact. It also looks like dividing the votes within the actual nation in the instance you're not able to persuade that politician to become someone for women. That means votes are likely to be spread across because you don't narrow down who you actually support and less likely to actually pass any politician in status quo. I'll take your point.
How would you stop conservative policies on your side in a majority conservative country?
It is not about taking down conservative policies. It is about actually passing policies that matter to these women. Conservative policies are going to exist and proliferate on either side of the house. You can't just say that because you're a woman and a woman is in power, it's ultimately going to change. You have to prove that. Next, on our counterfactual, we don't want to seem performative to the very people that we're supposed to protect. We're going to be the group that makes these women at least feel safe and represented, which is crucial and urgent because these women have not felt safety in their own state for the longest time. In conservative countries, progressive women's groups are bottlenecked. Better support systems are a more inclusive movement that actually represent and need them. Second, we want to appeal to these moderates and get these votes to the actual politicians that are going to cater to our policies and our goals as a progressive group with consistent messaging that they're likely to opt into. We're more likely to get things like moderates because it's going to be much more persuasive when the policies that you're voting for are consistent. When you get more votes and more critical mass, we narrow the voter choices to one that favors the movement and supports the movement, whether it be a man implementing the bill or not. It is about securing a win that is consistent with our goal. We don't have to win in every instance. Getting that one candidate is already important, which is extremely more likely than it will happen in opposition. Second argument then, why attacking these women are acts in self-defense and therefore something that is justified throughout. We think that first on framing, the only reason for a woman to ever oppose or criticize or attack a woman is only if it makes them feel like they're bad or in danger or being harmful. Acting in self-defense is an indisputable and absolute right given to every individual. And this is something that beats out their justification on, wow, this woman is something of a victim. You as a woman are likely to be someone that is mad, angry, and underrepresented and hurt because this movement, this entire group that ought to protect you, decided to protect that one individual in Senate. And this is something that's painful because the people who are meant to speak up for you are the ones who are attacking you the hardest. You're supposed to be a movement that gives you way to express your anger and express your experiences. You have to realize in conservative countries, the average woman has less agency, have glass ceilings, and harsher expectations. These organizations have more power and accessibility and should be doing this to be principally consistent for the actual woman they want to protect, and especially giving them the right to actually express themselves and defend themselves from the very attack that's coming from the state. They have a moral obligation to help these women and balance out the policies that are actually harmful. So what happens on proposition side? If women continue to have a passive stance without actively criticizing and actively being public about what they feel about these women politicians, these women who are like the very women in their movement are likely to internalize this. They're likely to feel and affirm the very fact that they are someone who's not worth fighting for. They're the ones who feel like, oh, maybe I'm overreacting, or oh, this is something not worth fighting for according to the very movement. So at that point, you have something of a very fragmented notion, an idea for these women to want to continue to fight for themselves. What is more likely to fuel a movement? A movement that continues to fight for the very women it actually ought to protect, or a movement that protects women for the sake of being women, even if it comes at the expense of the many? These are the kinds of things you have to consider, and we are willing to make that trade-off in opposition. If it means that one less women politician goes into the Senate, implies that we're more likely to get policies that support abortion, support divorce, and actually help the average individual if it's going to be passed by a man, we're willing to take that trade-off. But we're not willing to put these women aside. We're not willing to actually make sure that they're not able to defend and express themselves and get the policies that we actually demanded for. Thank you.
I would like to thank Leader of Opposition for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Deputy Prime Minister to continue with the case for proposition. Hear, hear.
If I may clarify, am I both audible and visible on everyone's end? Oops, hold on.
Yes, you are.
Oops, my camera's glitching. Hold up. All right. Oops. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Daniela, Dani for short, and my pronouns are they, them. I prefer my POIs via chat. I'll make sure to take one in the middle of my speech. So no need to badger because I'll give you time anyway to raise your point. And I hope you have a wonderful and productive debate this evening. Good luck with everyone. Opposition fails because they think that women hate women despite their similar experiences, despite their similar problems and struggles in life. Realistically, I want to ask panel, are women just going to be against the very solution to their problem? But sure, even if they're terrible people, we already told you, and it has already been considered of themselves, that it's likely because they're manipulated too, that it's because they're surrounded and being dominated by men or by people who have other beliefs, and they're just playing wisely to maintain their position, and so it sets a precedence that women can be leaders too, that these progressive women's groups ought to prioritize. Onto my speech then, firstly responses, secondly onto my extensions. Firstly responses with weighing. They come in here with one main case, that is to say that they're probably against the progressive women too, and they're hindering their advocacies, and therefore we ought to attack them. I have two problems with these. Firstly, this is in most cases not true, insofar as they are women. Even if they're in power, they still experience the hardships and struggles of growing up as a woman, again, within the context of these conservative states. So they most likely want to move out of their violent household as well, give education to their daughters, their very basic rights, or access reproduction rights. So we don't see why suddenly they're outright against the solution to their problems. Now, essentially, OP has to do the legwork of proving to us why women would want to bar themselves from accessing rights. They say that they want to achieve change, but it's unclear to us then how these groups will be able to forward policies for women if they're making it very likely for the person or people who feel for them the most to be away from power and capital because they contribute to the narrative by attacking these people that women shouldn't be leaders. But secondly, what we think then essentially, panel, that the likeliest characterization of these women within these states are women who probably have terrible policies like anti-poor or agreeing to wars and conflicts, and we think that they're going to be attacked either way. So the debate then is about whether this women's group should do this, and we believe not for the reasons such as one, that they further the narratives that women are terrible leaders and shouldn't be given power. So they essentially also lessen the likelihood of having politicians that actually feel for their struggles and would forward policies and laws that actually are catering to them. Secondly, then they try to be uncharitable and say that no, we're just going to have constructive criticism and criticize them. I want to be clear here, panel, that this is not the burden that they should defend in opposition's world, because this is completely untrue, because attacks, as stated in the motion, are not constructive criticism. So even if you do this, so for sure, for example, that you actually attack them, the benefit is marginal at best as a progressive group for women, because already this probably, because in a conservative states wherein women are constantly being villainized and attacked, there are probably already groups that have attacked these women before these women progressive groups for women. But secondly, then I want to point out then that they said that they ought to maintain their public image, so they have attacked to these women. I want to be clear that these progressive groups of women don't have an obligation to make sure that the state doesn't have terrible politicians and make sure that all the state policies are good. This is because in most instances they are already consisting of vulnerable groups of people whose primary goal is only to have someone in power to listen to them so their basic needs will be met. So I think it's terrible for opposition to add another burden that's already disenfranchised and vulnerable women to even solve the problems of the state and just continuously make sure that they have the perfect state and they have the perfect policies brought by these politicians. So while we do agree that attacking is justified because you're against a terrible politician, this shouldn't be what these groups particularly are doing in a place wherein it's very hard to have a woman in place of power. With you contributing to the attacks, you are less likely to be heard because the female politicians are even likely to get ousted or be seen as irrelevant, so she also won't be able to push forward for policies for these groups, i.e. the basic right to education, abortion rights, reproductive health bills, etc., which already we have proven to you right from the get-go a while ago that they're likely to feel about. The two impacts of this then come in twofold. That one, it will be harder for you to have a sustainable movement, but secondly, your advocacy will be harder to push because they do not feel represented. On to the second note, I want to clarify here then that negotiations are essential to address the urgency of the issues that are being faced by these groups. You cannot have negotiations when you attack, because obviously the government or the politician is not likely going to be open to negotiations if you're actively threatening them, threatening their power. Attacking the female politician only then results in the main solutions being delayed. And this is terrible insofar as there are women who are suffering now because of mistreatment, for example. And this is why you needed the support coming from the female politician who is already in power and know that achieving power within the states are very hard and takes years or even decades. Before I move on to the one main question I'd like to answer in this debate, as my extension, I'll take a point if there's any.
Your entire case is contingent on us believing that women have an intrinsic value to help other women into progressive ideals, when in most instances, because of the internalization, that is likely to make sure that they'll never vote for any progressive policy regardless.
All right, you have to note the simple fact that it's very hard for women to achieve such a power within the states. So for them to even be able to be there in power, that means to say that there are communities or groups of people who actually believe in them first, who actually contributed to them having political or social capital power first. And that's very likely to come in from these progressive groups of women, because know that we are operating in the context of conservative states, meaning to say that there's little to no people other than the women themselves who can actually feel for the struggles of women and help them out in gaining power. On to my extension then, firstly, why is this good for the progressive groups of women? Because we don't care in the status quo if there are bad politicians or not and they need to be called out. We have to prove why these specifically progressive groups have to do this, and we say that they're not supposed to do this because of the following reasons. That A, on setting a precedent of having female leaders in a state where there's really less likelihood of getting one, because know that if these groups contribute to the attacks, not constructive criticisms that look like opting to outright insults, telling them to step down, attacking them as a person, even if they don't mean it, they contribute to the already sexist and misogynist remarks that hinder and bar women from these states for getting their rights and power. So comparatively, if we just continuously negotiate with them and support their power to some extent, we guarantee that there will be women in patriarchal governments. And this is important because this is what allows more women to enter the state sometime in the future. So even if the women in power right now are Republicans or outright terrible people, at least there's still a lower barrier to entry for women to be seated in power, because we already believe we don't see their leadership as not credible and unreliable, because it's no longer a new thing for us in these states. There is a benefit that OP wouldn't have otherwise have access to. That one, having women sometime in the future in the powers who are actually good for policies that the progressive wants because of the precedents that we have already set and not destroy. But secondly, that there are still women who most likely experience misogynistic actions and sexism on their way to the top, which you have to engage because that's the most realistic case, especially in conservative states, can access as much education, can be heard as much still, suffered microaggressions, abuse, etc. So to some extent, they still have these shared experiences within these people from these progressive groups, and they're the only ones who are actually capable to pushing for their advocacies. But secondly, then under the same question still on the ability to address the urgency of these issues of this progressive group. From first, we made it clear the progressive policies aren't likely to be passed if the progressive group is actively attacking and antagonizing the politician. So even if negotiations aren't very vocal and loud, what matters is that you get the female politician to be able to listen and consider your situation first. Because note that any politician is likely to have backups when it comes to attacks against them. This is to say that once a female politician is attacked, it would likely resort to them being defensive or protecting their reputation even further. Given that the state is dominantly patriarchal, you cannot expect citizens to sympathize with the progressive group. OP cannot assume that all women in the states are progressive and have the same values. It would take a higher influence to persuade these people to actually fight for women's rights. And at the very least on our side, it is where you get to access very exclusive benefit of getting these women who already feel for your struggles as a woman in a progressive group to further your policies and further lobby for your advocacies. For all those reasons and more, I've never been prouder to represent gold. Thanks.
I would like to thank Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue with the case for opposition. Here.
Hi, I'll just set up my stopwatch, gather my thoughts, and then calm down before starting my speech. POIs verbally. Kindly don't badger. Okay. Before I start, just a few shout outs. Thanks to Kristen for spending the whole day with me yesterday. Thanks to our coaches from last year and this year for taking the time to help us grow and improve ourselves. Thank you to the whole team who stuck it out for 7 prelims and 3 out rounds. Individual shout out. So shout out to Sam, who isn't eligible for a speaker award. To Kiel and this hopeless romance. To Jasmine, who thought she was asked to become a trophy wife instead of a friend. To Aki and Mia, who are vibing right now, and to Ivan, who got a girlfriend and is leaving me alone. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I want to briefly characterize what women look like within these states and move on to the principle and the individual pragmatics of this round. Firstly, you have to realize, panel, that the women in these debates are oftentimes exposed to endless stereotypes based on their gender. They are relinquished to being housewives and nothing more. Gender-based policies often serve to only restrict them further, i.e., the Philippines only legalizing divorce in the last year, abortion being incredibly outlawed in several states. These are the individuals that are most in need of an entity that represents them, speaks out for them, and ultimately allows them to speak out for themselves in the long run. This is absent on proposition when they continue to stay neutral or even support politicians that actively go against the interests of women. Firstly, let's go on to the principle. But before that, let's characterize what attacks on these politicians likely look like and how they're going to manifest. Firstly, Danny tells you that they're likely going to look like attacks, and they're going to look like being incredibly violent and incredibly destructive. I tell you otherwise. Firstly, it actively looks like targeting and speaking up about policies that are not in the interest or in line with the views of the feminist movement in particular, i.e., so that's to say 2 things. Firstly, we're likely going to still be constructive in the process of attacking these politicians. But secondly, on the prop counterfactual about negotiations, I need you to note that these are often much longer and much harder to even begin. But I'll tell you few reasons why these attacks likely won't be incredibly violent and why likely won't form a incredibly radical perception of the movement. Firstly, these movements within these conservative countries likely don't want to appear radical in the first place. That's to say then that they actively want to avoid any form of attack that makes them seem even remotely radical, or at the very least they want to minimize that perception of themselves. But secondly, these movements recognize the vulnerable position of their members and then have a vested interest to not expose them to a greater degree of harm or a severe litigation by the state. Broadly, this means then that the overly negative perceptions of the movement don't form on our side. We're probably going to be constructive and seem far more reasonable to people on the ground. But secondly then, I need you to note that these attacks likely occur during instances where female politicians who are likely supported by conservative candidates with the same views push for the things that directly harm the interests of the movement already. That's to say then that proposition had the burden to prove why, firstly, it's still okay to simply allow these people to continue on with their policies without getting called out. But secondly, they had the urgency to prove why they had the leverage as women's groups to negotiate with these individuals and push them to change. So then, it's likely justified to continue on with these attacks for 2 reasons. Firstly, let's bite the bullet and say that we offend these politicians. I think they're still principally less important in this round. Firstly, note that politicians are likely conservative already, meaning they have the support of other conservative candidates in the context of these states that limits their likelihood of change. But secondly, they also had the wealth and power necessary to get into their positions anyway. Comparatively, women on the ground don't have access to the same amount of wealth and the same amount of security. Their expression is a greater priority. But secondly, you have to note the unique position of women's groups in this round, where they have the greater capacity. They have the greater capacity and the responsibility to speak out and attack the policies that harm women. Moving on then, let's talk about the individual impacts of this round. Firstly, I want to flag out that neither side can prove that legislative change gets enacted given the conservative nature of these states. That's to say, the proposition wants to support and wants to protect women who are already in power and simply wants to negotiate with them and push them to change. But they never prove the tipping point with regards to how that enacts change. I'll tell you why it likely doesn't happen. Firstly, I want to flag out how inherently harmful it is for these groups to even push for negotiation, because oftentimes these take comparatively more time, comparatively more legal work, comparatively more resources, meaning that in the process of even successfully getting to the meeting room, and then the longer process of enacting change and pushing these politicians to like change their policies, you lose out on funding for other pushes and the other needs of these women's groups. That's less outreach that goes to vulnerable communities. That's less time spent on women who need the help now. But secondly, the candidates that are likely going to be attacked are already those who have sided with the Conservative Party, affording them the position of the power in the first place. This means then that in a vie for political power, even if you do have somehow get the chance to negotiate with them, they're likely not going to change. They're likely going to want to side and continue to side with conservatives that are going to get them voted. So then the metrics of this debate shift from massively enacting change to making women down on the ground feel far more represented. And I think that's better in opposition. But before I move on, sure, I'll take a POI.
What will realistically happen if these groups attack these Republican that you say that are already loved by majority, the conservative citizens and conservative politicians?
I'll firstly tell you why that's bad. I'll secondly tell you why it gets more people to opt into the movement. Firstly, I'll talk about why these things are necessarily harmful on proposition side. Firstly, from the perspective of women who are already within the movement, when they see that you are still supporting a female candidate that is against things like divorce and abortion, they feel as if the movement is performative. They choose not to opt into it. They choose to opt out because they feel as if the movement doesn't represent them. Secondly, from the perspective of moderates, they become hypocritical in their eyes. This exacerbates notions of women's groups not knowing what they're talking about and them being loud and mindless. This means then that absent attacking these individuals, absent attacking these politicians, you seem far less reliable and far less firm in your stance. Thirdly, from the perspective of politicians, you only serve to affirm or at the very least allow them to continue to push for policies that harm women down on the ground. On proposition then, the chances of calling out these politicians and pushing voters away from them is zero. At least on opposition, it is non-zero. I think that's important. But secondly, lastly then, inherently, these politicians are also bad because at the point where Prop continues to support them, they also continue to support how their policies only serve to reinforce the stereotypes pushed into women. At the point where they never prove why these politicians are going to change, it only means then that when you continue to support them, women on the ground will feel as if it's okay to support a woman that tells you to stay in the kitchen. It's okay to support a politician that tells you that you don't need a higher pay or don't need better conditions. I think that's terrible. That means then that on opposition, what happens when we do continue to call these politicians out is a few things. Firstly, on the individual level, which is the most important in this round, because this is how we afford the most agency and representation to people down on the ground, we tell people, whether they are within the movement or outside of the movement, that we understand their plight, that we recognize that these politicians are ultimately still harming them. We make them more inclined to believe that the movement is a place and an entity that they can approach for support and for understanding. That's important because on proposition side, when the movement seems more split, when the movement seems far less representative of the interests of these people, then that means that less people are likely going to seek out for help. Less people are going to want to consult the people within these groups, and less people are going to be receiving aid. But secondly, when it comes to correcting these politicians, firstly, at the point where we do our burden of at the very least calling them out, that means comparatively, we have a greater chance of at least pushing them to change. Because when they have to contend with negative perceptions that are constantly being pushed onto them, they likely have to adjust to some degree. As opposed to your side, where negotiations come with little to no leverage and little to no likelihood of enacting change. We win this round for a few reasons. Crucially, we tell you why we're likely to make women feel more represented on our side. But secondly, we tell you then why this metric of the debate is best. Thanks.
I would like to thank Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and would like to call upon Government Whip to sum up a substantive part of this debate for Government Bench. Here.
Hello, before I start my speech, I'd just like to give a couple of shout outs. So first of all, to my team, thank you so much for all of the girls for sticking throughout the entire tournament and also the past tournaments. It's been such a pleasure debating with you, and it's always so fun debating here. And also to the other team who has continually actually been training with us and like has made Ateneo proud as well. And to all of our coaches, we wouldn't be here without you, especially Jaime, Matcha, like all of the other coaches that are here, and also our former coach Luigi. So thank you everyone. Before I start my speech, I'd just like to drink some water. But I just like to remind everyone that I take my POIs through chat, but if it's already the 5th minute, then you can raise them verbally. In a conservative country, where seeing a woman who is respected and in power is already extremely rare, you often have no choices. You have to take what little you have and not completely erase that and go back centuries. Look, on either side of the house, it is highly unlikely that you are likely to get any meaningful progressive change. The debate becomes then whether or not progressive groups should do this, not where we get progressive policies, but will engage and win on that later. 2 questions in this debate then. Firstly, where are women better off in the present? And secondly, where are progressive groups better off? And this is where we engage in their best case. First question then, where are women better off in the present? How did opposition try to answer this question? They say that it's better that you actually represent the interests of the majority of the women, and this is their benefit, right? Second, 2 problems with this. Firstly, I don't get why it's necessarily true that the majority of women on the ground have the same progressive values as this progressive group, given that they have also been conditioned in that same environment of a majority conservative country. This looks like how even in the Philippines, many mothers and women are still highly conservative and still don't want things such as abortion and divorce. In many other countries in the Middle East, many women still see themselves as solely the role of the mother. They can't just say they champion the interests of the woman without proving why women necessarily share those same interests, which they concede to in their POI by saying that they're unlikely to vote for progressives. An American woman does not represent the rest of the world because note, all women probably don't want to be beat up, but this is not solely a progressive belief. Note that this is debate winning because this proves that they don't necessarily win even in their best case. So note that their own characterization of the vast majority of women being conservative takes down their biggest benefit of acting in the interest of the majority of women. But secondly, I don't get how attacking the woman is representative of women's interests anyways. I think that the regular woman probably has enough of women being dragged down, and they were probably already extremely happy that they saw someone that looked like them in such a high seat of power, that they saw someone who was actually voted in and someone who was in TV. I don't think that a woman wants to see another woman being dragged endlessly on media, so this does not actually represent the interests of the woman. This is where you're much likely to get less political buy-in on your side. How did we answer this question comparatively then? We tell you women are much better off and you represent the interests of the women in the present now when you don't further exacerbate misogynist notions probably already present in these conservative countries. We tell you that this happens in 2 ways. Firstly, you actively diminish the credibility of women in leadership and positions and in power because you tell that very rare female politician that they are incompetent. You tell the rest of the conservative country who already probably believes that they were incompetent in the first place that women have no place in power because look what they do. They just go against the interests of the woman and they are complete failures. But secondly, you validate the notion that it's all right to be violent against women when they make mistakes. What more? Because you already do this against a woman in high seat of power. What more the woman that they have at home, the wives that they had at home? Note that this is important and outweighs their benefit of getting progressive policies because progressive policies like abortion and divorce don't necessarily prevent husbands from beating their wives at home, especially when they concede that conservative policies will exist either way. What's important is that you secure the value and respect that women have in this conservative society so that you protect women right now from being even more discriminated against, from even being even more belittled and beat up. How did we answer this question better then? Because I don't get why representing the woman's interests is the most important value for women, especially in a country where their values are greatly aligned with, as they conceded to. As such, we tell you that it is not actually a worthy trade-off just for the interest of the women, when you tell them, when you actively tell this conservative country that it is okay to continue doing, that it is okay to be aggressive towards these women, and that these women have no seats in power, this is where you actually go against the interests of the women, and it's where you actively harm them right now. But before I move on, any POIs? All right. Second question then, where are progressive groups better off? And this is where we engage and win by the metric. How did opposition try to answer this question? They say that they are more likely to get progressive policies if you don't stand and affirm these types of policies, right? Two problems to this. Firstly, this means that the progressive group would have to wait until they actually forward their concerns and actively fight for change. This is terrible because they solely rely on successful attacks in order to get any sort of change on their side. We tell you that it is extremely unlikely for three reasons. Firstly, for the reason that you are a progressive group in a majority conservative country probably already means that you are unlikely to get any change. What we prove to you is how this capacity actually diminishes on their side, especially when they say that they're not going to be radical, which means that you don't get any attention because you're already a minority group. Your stance isn't as impactful as you intended it to be. By their own characterization, they mitigate their own benefits. But secondly, if you say that the woman is a Republican and already has the support of majority politicians and average citizens too, what is the benefit then of you going against something that most people already agreed upon? Your benefit then is marginal at best. This is not the tipping point of the debate. They cannot win because they do not empower the progressive group that they're trying to defend. But thirdly, you destroy your direct link to the government in order to get change now. Because I think it is more likely that you're able to have constant connections with someone in power when there is actively a woman in power, so you can possibly enact a policy that women need to live a much safer life. I think it's more feasible that you are able to convince one woman in power who likely knows your struggle rather than an entire nation, right? But even in their best case, even if you're actually able to change these politicians, we think that your model doesn't address the urgency of the issues of these progressive women. Why is this the case? Because if negotiation on threatening your support for the politician is already hard, as they say, you have much more in attacking them and waiting for them to change and be for you, when at the same time, you invalidate their choices and you attack them. At the very least on your side, where you negotiate with them because maybe you just want to access food and shelter and not change the world and avoid wars as a woman who's been a conservative state, such benefits are likely to manifest much more because what you're asking is more realistic. It is an opposition where there is less buy-in because when attacking someone who's loved by the conservative state, then you are further put in a bad light and in harms of threat and ragtagging, making people less actually to sign up for your group even in the future. But before I move on, POI.
On
Yeah.
both sides, change is hard to enact. At least we tell you that we firstly have a greater chance of pushing voters away from these candidates. But secondly, we tell women that we understand the experiences. On your side, you still support them.
Yeah, how are you likely to push away an entire voter group of conservative people in a majority conservative country to vote for conservative policy for the politicians, right? I think that's extremely unrealistic, and that is why your case does not fly, because you're trying to convince an entire nation who's already conservative to suddenly become progressive. Magic does not work. What is the alternate path to victory that we actually suggest and we think is actually more feasible? We tell you that they are more likely to get the progressive policies that they want for a couple reasons. Firstly, when you're able to have female politicians in power in the first place, because we tell you that the female politician is probably already highly criticized, you adding fuel to the fire likely means that they get completely ousted, impeached, or lose so much support and power. It's so important that you don't drag these voters away from further voting for female politicians in the future, because these are the people who are likely to push forward your very own policies. Opposition never concedes you the harms that the progressive group is likely to face once they choose to attack. This is extremely detrimental because it further deteriorates the credibility of the movement in the eyes of the conservative citizens. Note that it is important for you to have a female politician in the first place because this is your best avenue to be able to create policies. But secondly, when you're able to have political buy-in because you're not actively seen as a threat and in nuisance, and you're still able to negotiate directly with the government, how do we win then? On likelihood, we think that you're more likely to be able to convince a politician who is already a woman and understands your struggles than trying to convince a whole nation of people who have been embroiled in conservative ideations to suddenly change their stances. On urgency, we don't ruin the reputation of the progressive group, which is vital for them to be heard. Thanks.
I would like to thank Government Whip for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Opposition Whip to conclude the substantive part of this debate. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, I have a few shout outs as well. First of all, shout out to all of Ateneo, everybody who's watching, all our coaches who are watching. Shout out to my team, Kristen and Pia. Both of you have been great mentors. Jasmine and Kiel for speaking this round. Thank you to my parents for allowing me to go here. And as I think the youngest person in the room, I'll start my speech in a bit. Starting my speech. In 3, 2, 1. When politicians pass policies that actively crack down on the agency of women, policies that bar things like abortion and divorce, that makes a living hell for the women on the ground, the problem doesn't become whether or not the politician was a man or a woman. The most potent effect is still the continued systematic oppression of vulnerable women that is still likely to be apparent in a world where they don't crack down on politicians that support it, regardless of whether or not they were women. I'm going to do a few things in my speech. First is clarify what a lot of the debate looks like, as well as the burden on Gov. Second, I'm going to be talking about the principle, why it's justified for women to attack these politicians. Third, why we elect progressive candidates that create tangible change. And last, why validating the experiences of women and representing them in a way that is true to the movement is likely to still be something that is a way to win this debate. First, clarifications. One, I think that it's incredibly unlikely for us to believe Gov's incredibly convenient frame of all women actually want to help out other women regardless. People like Sarah Palin and the PM of Brazil exist, which already break this down. But that's also the idea that they themselves are so entrenched in ideas of Christianity, for example, on conservatism, that moves them to act in a way that is incredibly conservative. So even if you try to negotiate, it won't change the set in stone values that they have rooted in their lived experiences just because they are women. It's like trying to convince Trump to not build the wall. The distinction between women and men is something that is still missing. But second, also note that the prerequisite to parties like the Republicans supporting these politicians anyways is them already internalizing these bigoted ideals, which is why you see most of the women within the Republican roster, like Sarah Palin, they're not likely to change because they're literally held at gunpoint by the Republican movement to be able to stay consistent with the things that are being done to them. So this is important because the prerequisite to Gov case is to even prove that these women will magically become SJWs and champion women. But engaging and being very kind, even in the instance that they do want to change and are suppressed, they don't prove by a relatively weaker group in the form of the movement that is made up of women, is likely to change the way that they're likely to act, especially since it is a much more powerful Republican group that already has a chip on their shoulder, as opposed to a much weaker group that isn't likely to enable them in an already predominantly conservative country. But the second clarification is, I don't think that women in the movement necessarily enforces the idea that women don't deserve to be leaders and we attack them, which is why progressive women leaders are still likely to be supported on their side. Obviously, women are not one big hive mind that are intrinsically connected, which is why there's still a distinction between right-wing women politicians and left-wing ones. But even if we buy that characterization that there is a distinction, the worst distinction and inconsistency is when you refuse to criticize the women, even when they have views that are so starkly different from your ideals as a movement. And this is where Gov is exposed to the harms of being subject to ridicule by the opposing party and losing the support of the populace and the moderates. I'll talk more about this later. But the only benefit that is left standing is that perhaps they have women in power. And now my question is, at what cost? The most acute impact is the policies that they're likely to pass that still harm women in a tangible way. It's not blanket representation that Kristen already pointed out. The policies that you do not contest because they were created and submitted by women. The inconsistency and doubt that the members of the movement are likely to feel. Because if it was a man, you were told not to treat their words as important. But it's different when it's another woman, and the movement doesn't seem like it reciprocates your feelings, even when they say the same things. The assumption from GovWhip was that women on TV means good. No, it is heartbreaking as a Filipino when I see someone saying that when I see another Filipino saying that all I'm good for is the farm. The effect is far more acute when it's another person who I thought related to me saying those hurtful things, as what Kristen said. This ends my clarifications and flips and means that the three outlandish assumptions their case is reliant on aren't sufficient to win them the debate. This leads me nicely into my issues. First, on the principle, why is it justified for women to attack these politicians? They said that these women are victims of the patriarchy, therefore it's unjustified to attack them. To which I have a few responses. The first is that the effects of the patriarchy, the way it shifted and shaped the minds of these politicians, are part of the lived experiences of these people. And even if they didn't consent to experiencing these lived experiences, the impacts of the actions that they might choose to take on the basis of these lived experiences is still something that we can choose to attack them on. Which is why even if somebody had a difficult childhood, or even if people didn't mean to kill another person, we still punish them because the impacts are still potent. And this is especially true when you yourself as a woman feel like you were oppressed by the policies that they're consistently putting out, which is why the policy and the principle of self-defense is still acute here, because these politicians chose to implement policies that actively harm women. Therefore, it's principally justified for them to act out and get angry because these are women that have been consistently oppressed since the dawn of time. We think that we give them an avenue to be able to do that. The important catharsis that is important for them to be able to make sure that they feel like they belong. This is principally justified. Their principle doesn't stand. But secondly, why we elect
Why?
progressive candidates that create tangible change. I said through chat, please don't be rude. And the meta here is that the reason why this is important is because proving which side is far more likely to elect politicians that are far more progressive is the prerequisite to more policies that protect women. I want to note here that even just one politician getting to a position such as the Senate or Congress is a large impact. It is a comparative of non-zero to zero, and this is still incredibly valuable because this likely means that they can still do things like actively pass bills to protect women and minorities, make women feel represented in governance even if they aren't the majority within these places. When they are seen consistently supporting their agency and not oppressing them, it's not magic. This is possible because we don't necessarily need the majority to be able to vote in a politician, which is how the Philippine opposition was still able to have Risa Hontiveros in the Senate, even if we weren't in the majority of cases. We don't have to be the majority, which is also why a disconcerted movement is insufficient in winning. Given the limited financial and political capabilities of the movement, it has to be a large united push, a large group of galvanized women, populists, and moderates that are going to be voting that we are far more likely to galvanize. Because the tipping point here is where we are able to galvanize the support of the women within the movement as well as the moderates. Why do we win this issue? One, you aren't seen as wishy-washy. You're seen as more consistent in your values, i.e., you attack all types of politicians that break down on your values as a feminist movement and as a women support group, which means that you're far more likely to be seen as legitimate. You're far more likely to be seen as a clear direction, which is something that is important for people who want to opt into the movement given the limited time and resources that they have, which means that when you're able to show to them, for example, on Gov side, that I support these people, not necessarily these people. So when people start dismissing you, when people are going to start ridiculing you, and when people are far less likely to opt in at the point at which your movement and your values are unclear. I'll take a POI now.
You tell us change is unlikely on our side, while also at the same time claiming that it's likely on your side because suddenly you're going to change the minds of conservative women that you
No,
say were already feel to be backward.
don't say that. It's not the fact that we're going to change the minds of conservative people, but that they change the minds of moderates. We're far more likely to be seen as palatable to the moderates when we don't just shove issues and be inconsistent with their policies, but when we're actually consistent and still choose to attack women, even when they support things like abortion, especially when they support things like abortion. It's not changing the minds of conservatives, it's galvanizing the people who are the most likely to support you right now, which means that we're far more likely to get the tangible change that is the prerequisite to good things. But the last thing is that validating the experiences of women and representing them in a way that is true to the movement. And the reason why this is important is because proving which side is likely to represent the inner struggles of the vulnerable women within the movement, which is the prerequisite for support systems, in a movement that makes women feel like they're powerful and heard, in a nation that rejects their ability to be anything other than a housewife, is important. But also this engages in the instance where we don't get politicians in their best case, even buying gov whips in on how we won't get any change. The important metric then is how well women are able to feel supported and feel represented by the movement. And we'd explain that it's specifically when it's you as a movement validate what they're feeling when they feel badly about how other women are passing down policies that actively prevent and make them feel as if they aren't enough, which is specifically why we're able to make women feel like they're special, which is an individual pathway by which we're able to win. On all accounts of this motion, I'm so proud to oppose.
I would like to thank Opposition Whip for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Opposition Reply to sum up the bench. Here.
Okay. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Yeah, just shout out again to Atenea. Very cool. We made it to finals. Hope also gives us a budget. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. A woman affirming the very things that traumatize you is one of the most painful betrayals that can occur to those who suffer deeply in it. Because regardless of the experience you shared, you continue to make options and choices that continue to put people through the thing that you try to avoid suffering. So two main issues then. First, where do we principally protect women? And second, where do we pass more policies for these marginalized women? First, on the principle, this is an independent path to victory because we're able to talk about the ability to defend yourself. Regardless of what happens in the government and what happens into the nation and state and whoever gets in, we still give the ability to uphold the rights of safety and representation that these women need. They weren't provided this by the state. They weren't provided this by their families, their people around them, especially continuing to face microaggressions. So it's very important and exclusive to get that catharsis and joy to the vast majority of individuals, whether regardless of what's going to happen, that's uncertain. This is something that's a likelihood and something that we approve. The moment they were not able to contend to this in proposition side, they concede to our benefit and concede to our analysis. Second issue then, where do we pass more policies for marginalized women? What does government say? They talk about the conservative women politician that they ought to protect and ought to back up. Let's flag out the biggest tension in their case. They first say that these women are deeply rooted patriarchal influence and value their position so much so they continue voting against progressive women's rights. At the same breath, they say that they're not likely to change their support. It was not sufficient for them to say they had shared experiences. This is already explained by first, second, and third, because they had to battle against the interests they very state themselves, at the desire for power and the years and years of patriarchal influence. The entirety of Op Bench talked about on the same metrics they want to win on, that backlash is likely stronger because it pushes politicians to adjust their policy and avoid negative perception, which strongly affects their incentives of power and forces them to answer the call to support women. We told it that even further that changing conservative female politicians' minds is not what this is debate about. It's not about face value representation, but getting better policies for the vast majority of individuals. To reframe a third proposition that women who are conservative matters because there are always going to be conservative women. It's about how these specific progressive women's group act out. There will be conservative support regardless. So it's about representing these rights and these women who actually need it. They limit their own impacts because they talk about a progressive they have talked about how making a progressive one progressive politician will not impact the conservative state. We told you how this is different, and we told you how we're likely to get more change when it comes to politicians. What did we say all? We told you about those within the movement who optically outnumber the few conservative female politicians who we have to cater to. We're on the very same metric about supporting those who are vulnerable, and that means we're outweighed that by magnitude and scale. There are ones who are going to feel betrayed by this movement, the ones who are if there is a female politician or not. We told you about the moderate and tipping point about getting the vast majority of votes. This will likely it's not about just changing the conservative mindsets, but changing those who are likely and able to support the very movement to at least get a few rights and a few votes in. There will always be a pull towards protecting progressive women because of the extra votes to widen the gap in the election. So it doesn't have to be through the gateway of having a woman vote for another woman, because there's always going to be other groups and other parties who are going to be interested in wanting to cater to these rights, because it means that you get extra leverage and extra votes in place of giving us that policies and giving us what's needed. So if you want to talk about where do we get to empower a lot more women and where we're likely to get some progressive change for these women on the ground, you have to side with opposition. We told you about first how we're likely to get votes and seem a lot more consistent, why this messaging is something that's important, and how we're able to break down the tensions of the debate. Thank you.
I would like to thank Opposition Reply for that fine speech and would like to call upon Proposition Reply to deliver the last speech of this debate. Hear, hear.
Hello, everyone. Once again, I'm Daniela Dani for short. My pronouns are they, them, and thank you so much for the wonderful and productive debate this evening. Good luck with everyone. If I may ask before I proceed with my speech, am I both audible and visible on your end?
Yes, you are.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Setting up my devices. I want to ask a simple question, panel. I want you all to listen carefully. Realistically, is it easier to convince one woman who knows your struggle already, or an entire nation of conservatives, or even millions of moderates, which is a new model brought by OpWhip? Because the worst case on our side is that you become complicit with conservative policies, but coming from the whip, we ask why this is horrible when they concede that the majority of women will still be conservative. So I don't get why representation of the majority of the women is so important, because representing the majority of the women necessarily means that you have to be complicit with the conservative policies. Whereas, even in their very, very best case, we're sure you get a progressive politician, there will be no more women in power because you prove that they were incompetent at first. The fact that they push for a small group's interest while dooming women everywhere is the reason why they lose this debate. On to the clashes then. Firstly, where are the progressive groups better off? Because I want to note that regardless if the progressive groups will bash or attack these women, they will still be attacked regardless, simply because they're a woman within these conservative areas. But secondly, where are the women better off? Firstly, where are the progressive groups better off? Two levels. A, on support. Note that they can't claim converting moderates as exclusive because both sides can campaign. But time and time again, moderates are much less likely to be swayed when they see that you are aggressive and forceful to other people. We garner more public support when women feel as though the community they belong to is one that doesn't regurgitate the same toxic beliefs that the society already normalizes within this context, which is to say that women are terrible leaders and are incompetent human beings. Most likely, these progressive women's groups are the only form of solace for women in these conservative environments. So at least on our side panel, they're not further threatened or harmed because they're less likely to get red tagged as brought by our whip by the same conservatives that obsess make up the most population. This means then that if they say that these women aren't progressive and are conservatives loved by the majority, attacking them and going against them as a minority will make your groups even more vulnerable to red taggings, to threats, and a backlash. So a woman who wants to access such a group for a safe space that is already very limited within such states are disincentivized further to actually join a group that is outcasted, red tagged, and threatened. In opposition, you fail to be there as a safe space. But secondly, on likelihood and realistic urgency of change, Op's case is very audacious. They say that we're unrealistic and unlikely when it is their case that forces these minorities from progressive groups who probably just want to get by and have access to the very basic needs to change the world and go against conservatives that make up the most of the population as conceded by both teams and put their lives at harm. With negotiations in the comparative, even if the female politician is for wars or anti-poor, at least your very basic needs of shelter from violent households or just foods on your table are most likely to be met and heard because the woman who probably feels for your group is still empowered or is still in power or seats of this political capital. Secondly then, where are the women better off? On a simple reason, on the ability to be leaders sometime in the future. It's right to assume, right, that these attacks' goals are to oust these politicians so far as obsessed, they will be hard to convince to change their mindsets anyway. And this is important because these precedents is what makes making women leaders a norm little by little within these states. This is a unique benefit absent in opposition that they don't have direct responses on. There's already a high enough barrier to entry for women in politics and discourse, especially in these states. So if we opt to perpetuate as a progressive group for women the already existing norms and narratives that women are terrible leaders and oust them from power, then how likely are we to even have more female politicians in power in the future? Because regardless if the leader right now is good or not, what we ought to think of is where there will be more female in politics in the future and be incentivized to heard your struggles and advocacies because they experience the same things and not burden the women within these progressive groups to change your country even if they're vulnerable themselves. Because even if they have progressives, they're not guaranteed to be for women. Op fails because they don't just fail to be a safe space as a progressive women group to vulnerable people within the states when they subject them to external retaliation and red tagging, but also fail to support the precedents of having female leaders that are likely to feel for their struggles in the future because they supported the very loud notion within these states that women aren't capable to be leaders or commit mistakes, that women are good for nothing. For all those reasons and more, I've never been prouder to stand in Gov. Thanks.
I would like to thank Proposition Reply Speaker for that fine speech, and I would like to thank you all for excellent debate. Now, I guess we will get a breakout room.
Yes, judges, I'll give you a breakout room in just a moment. You can go there and you can reach your verdict. Thanks both teams for a wonderful final, showing us once again why Ateneo are such a awesome power in Asian debating. Super impressive and I'm sure very inspiring to everybody who's watching. So judges, I'm about to make you a breakout room. We are going to have the closing ceremony in 30 minutes time, a quarter past. So that means you have 29 minutes, judges, to come to your decision, okay? Just bear with me a second.
Thank you so much for the round, everyone. We enjoyed the round and we also enjoyed our experience as a whole in WSDL. Thank you and good luck.
Thanks for the round.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks for the round.
Okay, judges, your breakout room is open. Everybody else, we will see you in 30 minutes.